The town of Canterbury was picturesque, a place where church bells tolled every Sunday, and families gathered in pristine homes to say grace before their meals. It was a town that prided itself on its traditions, where faith was both a comfort and a weapon, wielded to keep people in line. The Delaney family stood at the center of it all, not just as devoted members of the community, but as its moral compass. Father Elijah Delaney was more than just a priest. He was a force in the pulpit. His sermons could bring even the most hardened souls to their knees, his voice rising and falling like the tides, demanding repentance, obedience, and faith. His wife, Grace, was the perfect counterpart, a pillar of quiet devotion, her presence in the church's charity work making her just as admired as her husband. Together, they were untouchable. But beneath the surface of their perfect life lay a secret they fought desperately to bury. Their son, Kevin, had never fit the mold Elijah had set for him. Even as a child, Kevin's quiet defiance unsettled his father. At 4 years old, while the other boys played rough in the streets, Kevin sat alone, draping his mother's scarves over his shoulders, twirling in front of the mirror with a quiet, secret joy. Grace watched, her love for him unconditional but laced with dread. She knew the town, the church, and her husband, what they would say, what they would do. She knew what Elijah would see, not innocence, but a flaw that needed to be corrected. "He's just playing," Elijah had said at first, waving off the concern. But as Kevin grew, so did the unease. At 7, after Sunday school, he came to Grace in tears, his small hands gripping hers, his voice a whisper thick with fear. "Mama, I think God made a mistake." Grace held him tightly, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. But when Elijah heard, his reaction was starkly different. That night, he locked himself in the church for hours, his prayers growing frantic, his voice breaking in the darkness. He pleaded for strength, for answers, for a way to set things right. As Kevin grew older, the distance between him and his father became a chasm. He was different, and in Canterbury, different was dangerous. The whispers in the congregation turned into stares, then into outright contempt. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter when Kevin passed. Boys from the choir sneered at him in the hallways, their insults sharp and unrelenting. Elijah felt it too, the murmurs in the church, the doubt in his parishioners' eyes. If he couldn't control his own household, if he couldn't shape his own son into a man of God, how could he lead them? His authority eroded with each passing year, his grip on his community slipping like sand through his fingers. And Kevin learned to hide. He learned to shrink into the background, to make himself small, to avoid the wrath of his father and the cruelty of the town. But it was never enough. Grace fought for him, shielding him from Elijah's anger, from the town's judgment. "He's sensitive," she would say with a hollow smile, standing between Kevin and a world that wanted to break him. But she couldn't protect him from everything. By the time Kevin reached his teenage years, the weight of it all had begun to suffocate them. The home that had once been a sanctuary became a prison, its walls thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment. And Elijah, torn between the love of a father and the duty of a priest, stood at the edge of something dark, teetering between faith and blood, between what he believed and what he feared. It was Grace who first whispered the idea, her voice barely audible over the tension that filled the room. "We need help," she said. But deep down, they both knew Canterbury wasn't a place for help. It was a place for judgment, and judgment was coming. By the time Kevin turned 16, his despair was impossible to ignore. He became a shadow of the boy he had once been, withdrawing into himself, retreating to his room for hours. There he poured his soul into journals, scribbling down thoughts and feelings that no one could understand, or sketching images of himself as a girl. When Grace found these drawings, the truth she had feared for so long became undeniable. Kevin wasn't just different. He was trapped in a body that felt foreign, that didn't belong to him. Grace approached Elijah late one night after Kevin had gone to bed, her steps slow, her mind heavy with the weight of what she knew. She sat him down at the dining table, her hands trembling in her lap. "Elijah," she said, her voice cracking under the pressure, "we have to do something. We can't let him suffer like this." Elijah recoiled, his eyes narrowing as he gripped the edge of the table. "This is unnatural," he muttered, his voice strained. He recited scripture, his faith battling his fear. But Grace, usually so reserved, spoke with an intensity that shook him to the core. "God gave us Kevin," she said, her voice low but resolute, tears threatening to spill. "He didn't ask to feel this way. We have a choice. We can either support him or lose him entirely." Those words haunted Elijah, like an unbearable weight pressing down on his chest. He had seen too many young lives lost to despair, lives crushed by the unforgiving gaze of their community. After weeks of agonizing prayer and sleepless nights, Elijah could no longer ignore the gnawing fear in his heart. He reluctantly agreed to seek help. The journey that followed was long, painful, and marked by more setbacks than triumphs. Kevin, now 18 after years of therapy and internal conflict, made the harrowing decision to undergo gender affirmation surgery. For the Delaney's, it was a bittersweet moment, a paradox of joy and sorrow. They had longed for their child to be free, but the road ahead promised nothing but suffering. Their decision to move to a new town was born from necessity, driven by the need to escape the judgmental eyes of those who knew them. Kevin became Kiara, the name that would now represent the person she had always been. But the Delaney's knew their sacrifice was just beginning. Kiara's recovery was excruciating, both physically and emotionally. She spent months fighting the pain, both of her body and the constant weight of shame she had carried for so long. There were days when she questioned her choices, overwhelmed by self-doubt and the haunting knowledge that the world would never accept her for who she truly was. But Grace never left her side. She held Kiara through every tear, every moment of despair. Elijah, quieter but just as steadfast, prayed every night, hoping that God would grant Kiara the strength she needed to survive. As Kiara slowly began to rebuild her life, she enrolled in college, pursuing her love of art history. She made friends, attended parties, and, perhaps for the first time, felt a sense of belonging, though it was fragile, always teetering on the edge of fear. Despite her outward progress, Kiara kept herself guarded. The walls around her heart remained impenetrable, built to protect her from the devastating truth of her past being exposed. Grace, ever hopeful, urged Kiara to open herself up to love, to let others in, but Kiara always refused. "It's too risky," she would say, shaking her head. "I can't." Elijah, still a priest in their new town, carried his own burden of guilt. He had deceived his congregation, lying about his family's past, and each day the weight of that sin gnawed at him. Yet when he looked at Kiara, when he saw her smile, fragile yet radiant, he convinced himself that the lie had been necessary, that it was the only way to save her. But the guilt never left, and neither did the fear, the constant, suffocating fear of what might happen if their secret ever came to light. The town, the church, the world, they would never forgive them. They would never understand. Protecting Kiara was the only thing that mattered to Grace and Elijah, and they knew deep down that nothing could threaten their delicate peace. But everything changed the night Kiara met Jansen Miller. It was at a charity art auction, an event Kiara had worked tirelessly to organize as part of her job at the local gallery. She had expected the night to be like any other, crowded with pretentious guests, all preoccupied with their wealth and status. But Jansen was different. A young architect known for his groundbreaking designs, he was there to bid on a piece for his firm's headquarters. From the moment their eyes met, Kiara felt a surge of emotion, something raw and unfamiliar, a feeling she had buried for so long. Jansen was tall, with dark wavy hair, and a smile that seemed to cut through the stiffness of the room. His charm was undeniable, but it was his kindness that caught her off guard. Their first conversation was easy, natural, yet underneath it all, Kiara could feel the weight of the truth she had worked so hard to hide. She was captivated by his warmth, by the way he listened to her, by how he seemed to truly care. And for the first time in years, Kiara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. Over the next few months, their relationship deepened. Jansen was attentive, loving, and filled with romantic gestures that made Kiara feel special. But as much as she tried to let go of her past, the guilt clung to her like a shadow, always hovering in the background. Every time Jansen spoke about their future, about marriage, children, a life together, Kiara's heart would race in fear. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the thought of losing him, of everything shattering, was too much to bear. She would always tell herself, "I'll tell him one day," but not yet. Then came the evening that would change everything. The summer sun was setting over Canterbury, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. Kiara stood on the balcony of her small, modest apartment, sipping wine, unaware that the night she had been dreading was about to begin. Jansen had spent weeks planning it. He had enlisted the help of her closest friends and co-workers to ensure that everything went perfectly. Kiara believed they were simply going out for another dinner, one of their countless dates. She had no idea what awaited her. When she arrived at the restaurant, her breath caught in her throat. The terrace was bathed in the glow of fairy lights and roses, her favorite flowers, their scent cloying in the evening air. A small band played soft, romantic tunes in the background, adding to the surreal atmosphere. As Jansen led her to the table set for two, his nervous smile betrayed the confidence he usually wore so effortlessly. Kiara noticed his hands trembling as he poured the champagne. The sight stirred something in her. Was he nervous? Was he hiding something? Or had she been so consumed by her own fears that she couldn't see the truth? But she didn't comment on it. Instead, she smiled, feeling her heart swell with affection. Jansen always made her feel like she was the center of his universe, and tonight was no exception. As the night wore on and the soft hum of music surrounded them, Jansen stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. Kiara watched him, her heart suddenly racing. Time seemed to slow as he reached into his pocket. Then, before she could even comprehend what was happening, Jansen knelt before her, holding out a velvet box. The restaurant fell silent. All eyes were on them, watching, waiting for what was about to unfold. Kiara's breath hitched as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. In that instant, she realized her entire life was about to change. She could no longer hide from the past that had always haunted her. And no matter how much she loved Jansen, no matter how desperately she had longed for this moment, she knew the truth would tear them apart. The shadow of her secret loomed larger than ever before. Kiara's breath caught as Jansen opened the velvet box, revealing a diamond ring that gleamed with an unnatural brilliance, as though it carried the weight of her entire life's hidden truths. "Kiara," he began, his voice unwavering, but his eyes betraying the depth of emotion flickering within him. "From the moment I met you, I knew my life had changed forever. You've brought light into my world in a way I never thought possible. Will you do me the honor of being my wife?" The words hung in the air, and Kiara's heart pounded in her chest. She nodded, her tears falling freely as the ring slid onto her finger, the applause of the onlookers distant, muffled by the overwhelming knot of dread in her stomach. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face into his shoulder. But in that fleeting embrace, the gnawing thought that haunted her every waking moment surged. What will he do when he finds out the truth? In the shadows of a dimly lit bedroom not far from the restaurant, Lena sat alone, her laptop casting an eerie glow on her face. Her eyes glinted with a dangerous obsession as she watched Kiara's engagement unfold before her. Lena had been fixated on Jansen for years. Their first meeting had been during a project collaboration at his architectural firm, where she had worked as an intern. Jansen's kindness had left a lasting impression on her, despite his polite but firm disinterest. Lena had convinced herself that they were meant to be together, that he simply hadn't realized it yet. When Jansen began dating Kiara, Lena's initial crush morphed into quiet resentment. She watched them, obsessively following their every move on social media, analyzing each photo, each comment, convinced that Kiara didn't deserve him. As their relationship deepened, so did Lena's jealousy. She fantasized about ways to break them apart, her thoughts lingering on darker possibilities, until the news of their engagement shattered any pretense of restraint. Lena spent hours scrolling through Kiara's social media profiles, searching for any flaw, any detail that would give her a way in. During one of her obsessive searches, Lena stumbled upon an old tagged photo of Kiara from years ago. Her hair was shorter, her features subtly different, and the caption mentioned a name: Kevin. It was an innocent enough detail, but it ignited a spark of suspicion in Lena's mind. Who is Kevin? Determined to uncover the truth, Lena delved into a relentless online investigation, sifting through old records, piecing together fragments of Kiara's past. It didn't take long before Lena uncovered the devastating truth. Kiara had undergone gender-affirming surgery. The discovery sent a twisted thrill coursing through Lena's veins. She had what she needed: what she had always needed, a weapon to destroy Kiara and finally claim Jansen for herself. The day of the wedding arrived, a grand affair held in the historic St. Michael's Cathedral, where towering stone walls and stained glass windows bathed the interior in a kaleidoscope of colors. The atmosphere was almost ethereal, like something out of a dream, but beneath the beauty was a tension that none of the guests could feel, except for Lena. Family and friends, dressed in their finest attire, filled the cathedral, their laughter and chatter floating through the air, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to tear everything apart. The quiet hum of anticipation filled the space, but Lena, standing silently among them, already knew that the moment Kiara uttered her vows, her life would never be the same. She would make sure of it. Kiara stood alone in the bridal suite, her heart hammering beneath the intricate lace of her gown. She was a vision of grace, her long hair cascading in soft waves, but beneath the surface, a storm churned. The smile she wore was tight, forced, nothing like the joy she had imagined for this moment. Grace stood beside her, adjusting the veil on Kiara's head, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "You look beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with both pride and a creeping anxiety that hung heavy in the air. Elijah, standing by the window, gazed out at the gathering crowd below. The weight of their family's secret pressed down on him like an unbearable weight. It was unspoken, but it was there, looming, suffocating. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "There's still time to tell him." Kiara shook her head, her resolve faltering only slightly. "No, Mom, he loves me for who I am. He doesn't need to know." Her voice quivered, but she quickly steadied herself. "Today is about starting a new life. I won't let my past ruin that." The ceremony unfolded flawlessly, a picture of perfection, a blend of tradition and personal touches. Jansen's vows were heartfelt, his voice cracking with emotion as he promised to love and cherish Kiara for the rest of his life. Kiara's hands shook as she slid the ring onto his finger, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Love, fear, the deep, gnawing certainty that the truth would come for them both one day. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was deafening. A brief moment of bliss where Kiara allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay, that she could escape her past and live the life she wanted. The reception was grand, the banquet hall bathed in soft light from shimmering chandeliers and cascading floral arrangements. Guests danced, laughed, and toasted to the newlyweds. Kiara and Jansen shared their first dance, their eyes locked in a moment that felt as if the world had faded away. But beneath her radiant smile, a gnawing anxiety clung to Kiara, one she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. As the evening wore on, Jansen excused himself to take a phone call. Stepping onto the terrace, he answered an unknown number. His voice was polite, but his curiosity was palpable. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold and deliberate, each word drawn out with malice. "Jansen," the voice began, "I thought you deserved to know the truth about your new wife." Jansen frowned, confused. "Who is this? What are you talking about?" The caller identified herself as Lena. Her voice dripped with venom as she wasted no time unveiling Kiara's deepest secret. Each syllable she spoke was carefully calculated, designed to wound. "She's been lying to you, Jansen." Lena's voice was thick with triumph. "Kiara isn't who she says she is. She's been hiding her true self from you all this time. She's not even a woman." Jansen's breath caught in his throat, a sickening feeling flooding his chest as Lena went on, detailing the medical records she had found. The weight of her words slammed into him like a punch, each one twisting deeper than the last. He ended the call abruptly, his mind reeling, the knot of doubt and anger curling tightly in his stomach. For a long moment, Jansen stood frozen in the cold air, the distant sounds of laughter from the reception cutting through the haze of confusion and betrayal clouding his thoughts. With a strained breath, he returned to the banquet hall, his expression carefully neutral. But Kiara, sensing the shift, caught his eye. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice a thread of concern. The weight of her question hung in the air, but Jansen could only stand there, the truth, now haunting him, tearing through the thin veil of happiness they had built. Jansen forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside him. As the night wore on, the once vibrant atmosphere at the reception began to wither. Guests trickled out, leaving behind only a few close friends and family members who lingered for one last toast to the couple's happiness. Kiara, still radiant in her wedding gown, moved through the room, thanking everyone with her practiced smile, but beneath the veneer, a creeping sense of dread gnawed at her. Jansen's demeanor had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. His laughter had become hollow, his smile strained, and his responses curt. Kiara had tried to approach him, to ask if something was wrong, but each time he dismissed her concern with a casual excuse about being tired. Yet the intensity in his gaze whenever he looked at her was something else, something darker, colder, that she couldn't quite place. Back in their suite, the tension between them became unbearable. Jansen poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands trembling slightly as he brought the glass to his lips. Kiara watched him, her anxiety building with every passing second. "Jansen, is everything okay? You've been acting strange since that phone call," she asked, her voice soft but steady, though fear tightened her chest. For a long moment, Jansen said nothing. He stared into his glass as if searching for answers in the amber liquid. Finally, he set it down, his eyes locking onto hers, cold and calculating. "Who called me tonight, Kiara?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. "And what did they want to tell me about you?" Kiara's heart skipped a beat, her worst fears rushing to the surface. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence between them thickened, suffocating. Jansen's gaze hardened, and he took her hesitation as an admission. "Answer me," he demanded, slamming his fist onto the table. Kiara flinched, tears springing to her eyes. I don't know who called you," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me, Kiara," he spat, standing abruptly and pacing the room like a caged animal. "They told me everything. About your past, about the surgeries. Is it true? Were you born a man?" The words cut through the air like a blade, the final blow to a life she had carefully constructed. Kiara's world seemed to collapse around her, the foundation of her new life crumbling to dust. "Jansen, I can't explain," she pleaded, her voice breaking as she reached out to him. "It's not what you think." "What's not what I think?" Jansen laughed bitterly, pulling away from her touch. "Then what is it, Kiara? Tell me how you've been lying to me this whole time. How you've been pretending to be someone you're not." Kiara couldn't hold the truth in anymore. The weight of her secret became too much to bear. She broke down, her body trembling with the effort to speak. Through sobs, she recounted her childhood, her struggles with identity, and the surgeries her parents had arranged to give her the life she deserved. "I didn't want to deceive you, Jansen," she sobbed, her words spilling out in a rush. "I love you. I was afraid of losing you." But her confession only seemed to fuel his fury. "Afraid of losing me?" Jansen's voice cracked, a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "So you decided to manipulate me instead? To make me marry you without knowing the truth?" The words felt like a slap, each one leaving a bruise deeper than the last. The man she had married, her love, her partner, was slipping away from her, replaced by a stranger whose anger and hurt were too raw to ignore. She had no idea if she could ever find her way back to the man she thought she knew. Desperate to salvage the situation, Kiara reached for her phone and dialed her parents. Grace and Elijah arrived within minutes, their faces marked with worry and confusion. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, his gaze darting between his daughter and Jansen, who stood still, his body rigid with barely contained rage. "She lied to me," Jansen spat, cutting Kiara off before she could speak. "Your daughter lied to me about who she is." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Jansen, please, we can explain. Kiara's been through so much in her life. She didn't mean to hurt you." But Jansen wasn't listening. His anger was volcanic. "She didn't mean to hurt me. She made a fool of me in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The argument escalated quickly, the tension between them palpable. Kiara tried to intervene, but her words were lost in the shouting. The atmosphere was thick with anger, and the space between them seemed to close in with each passing moment. Elijah raised his hands in a vain attempt to restore some semblance of calm. "Jansen, please, let's sit down and talk this through, like adults." "Talk?" Jansen sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "There's nothing to talk about. Your whole family is a bunch of liars. You hid this from me just as much as she did." The situation was spiraling out of control. Kiara's heart raced as she watched Jansen storm to the closet, his eyes wild. He retrieved a gun, a cold metallic object that had no place in this night, this life. The sight of it froze her blood. "Jansen, no!" Kiara screamed, stepping forward, her body instinctively moving to protect her parents. "Move, Kiara," he growled, his voice cold and unrecognizable. Panic surged within her. The chaos was too much, her heart pounding in her chest as Jansen's hand tightened on the trigger. A deafening bang shattered the air, followed by the sickening thud of Grace's body hitting the floor. She collapsed, clutching her chest, blood pooling beneath her. Kiara's scream echoed through the room, her legs giving way as she collapsed beside her mother. Desperation clawed at her. "Elijah!" she cried, but it was too late. He lunged at Jansen in a futile attempt to stop the madness, but Jansen was faster. Another shot rang out. Elijah crumpled to the ground, his body a broken heap at her feet. The room fell silent, save for the harsh sound of Kiara's sobs and Jansen's heavy breathing, the gun still gripped tightly in his shaking hands. "Why, Jansen?" Kiara cried, her voice cracking, filled with anguish. "They were trying to help us." "They lied to me," he said, his voice hollow. His hands trembled as he pointed the gun at her. "Just like you did." Kiara sank to the floor beside her parents, her wedding dress now stained with their blood. She looked up at Jansen, her eyes wide, pleading, desperate for mercy. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything. Please don't do this." For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if her words had reached him. His grip on the gun wavered, his face softening, but the weight of the betrayal he felt crushed whatever warmth had remained. With tears streaming down his face, Jansen's hand tightened once more. The trigger was pulled. Kiara's body crumpled to the floor, her blood mingling with that of her parents. Her eyes, wide in shock, locked onto Jansen's for one final moment before the light left them. Jansen stood over her, the weight of his actions crashing down on him like a wave. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor, the sound deafening in the silence that followed. As Jansen collapsed to his knees, his body racked with uncontrollable sobs, the police arrived to a scene beyond comprehension. The room was soaked in blood, a grotesque tableau of destruction. Jansen sat amidst the carnage, his hands raised in a pitiful gesture of surrender. His face, once full of life, was now a blank mask, pale and contorted with anguish. His voice, hollow and emotionless, spilled out the confession. Every detail, every horrific moment. The words fell from his lips like ashes, and it was clear that he was no longer the man who had once stood beside Kiara. He was a shell, broken by the weight of his own actions. The aftermath of that night scarred everyone connected to Kiara and Jansen, leaving wounds that would never heal. The small Catholic community, once a stronghold of tradition and unity, found itself torn apart. News of the brutal murders spread like wildfire, with the media sensationalizing every detail. Headlines painted the tragedy as one of betrayal, lies, and unbridled rage. Some portrayed Jansen as a man driven to the edge by deceit, while others branded him a monster, incapable of understanding the complexities of love or compassion. Kiara's funeral was a quiet affair, the air thick with grief. Only a handful of close friends and distant relatives gathered to mourn her, their sorrow muted by the weight of the scandal that had shattered their world. Her parents, Grace and Elijah, were laid to rest alongside her, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses. The priest who officiated the ceremony spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, but his words felt empty. To those who had witnessed the violence, the notion of absolution was as distant as the stars. In the days that followed, the church became a battleground for divided opinions. Some parishioners condemned Grace and Elijah for keeping Kiara's secret, blaming them for the bloodshed that had followed. Others argued that they had acted out of love, desperately trying to shield their daughter from a world that could never accept her. Father Leonard, the priest, found himself trapped in the crossfire. His sermons were interrupted by pointed questions, accusations about morality, acceptance, and faith in an ever-changing world. Jansen's trial quickly became a media circus, drawing national attention as legal teams locked horns over the nuances of his actions. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculating killer, consumed by rage and incapable of processing his emotions. They highlighted the methodical nature of the murders, emphasizing how Jansen had retrieved the gun, aimed with precision, and executed 3 people who had posed no immediate physical threat. The defense, however, leaned heavily on the psychological toll of Kiara's revelation. Jansen's lawyers argued that he had been driven into a temporary state of insanity, overwhelmed by a betrayal that shattered his core beliefs and sense of self. They called in psychologists who testified that the shock Jansen experienced upon learning the truth about Kiara had triggered a traumatic break from reality, leading to his violent outburst. The trial divided public opinion. LGBTQ+ activists rallied around Kiara's memory, demanding justice and highlighting the dangers of transphobia and intolerance. They framed Jansen's actions as a hate crime, rooted in an inability to accept Kiara's truth. On the other side, more conservative voices argued that Kiara's deception had been the catalyst for the tragedy, sparking debates over the ethics of disclosure and the complexities of identity. The lines were drawn sharply, and there seemed to be no room for middle ground. As the court proceedings continued, the community that had once been united in faith now stood fractured, the echoes of that fateful night reverberating through every conversation, every whisper. The pain and anger lingered, poisoning every attempt at healing. And in the midst of it all, Jansen sat in his prison cell, a man lost to his own darkness, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. In the end, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Jansen was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, his actions deemed unforgivable, despite the mitigating factors presented by his defense. As he was escorted away in handcuffs, his face was a mask of despair and crushing regret, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. In death, Kiara became a symbol of both hope and heartbreak, her story sparking endless discussions about gender identity, acceptance, and the suffocating societal pressures that forced individuals like her to conceal their true selves. LGBTQ+ organizations adopted her name, using it as a rallying cry for equality and protection, launching campaigns to educate communities about the harsh realities faced by transgender individuals. A foundation was established in Kiara's memory, funded by anonymous donors who believed in her vision of love and acceptance. The foundation offered counseling, medical support, and legal assistance to transgender individuals, striving to bridge the insurmountable gap between faith communities and the LGBTQ+ population. The goal was to foster dialogue and understanding in places where the two had long been at odds. But the backlash was fierce. Conservative pundits and religious leaders condemned the foundation, claiming it glorified deception and undermined traditional values. Vigorous debates raged across social media, with Kiara's name invoked as a battle cry for opposing ideologies. Jansen's time in prison was one of deep isolation and relentless introspection. Though he had initially been defiant, he eventually faced the crushing weight of his actions. In the solitude of his cell, he sought solace in the faith he had once wielded like a weapon against Kiara. Hours were spent in the prison chapel trying to reconcile with the very belief system that had fueled his rage. Jansen wrote letters to Kiara's surviving family members, apologizing for his role in the tragedy and expressing the deep remorse he could never undo. The letters, though unanswered, became his only outlet, a place to channel his guilt and slowly confront the grief he had long avoided. In interviews with psychologists and journalists, Jansen opened up about the moment he discovered Kiara's secret. He described the overwhelming sense of betrayal, the cultural and religious expectations that had shaped his reaction. Over time, however, he began to understand the immense pressures Kiara had faced, and he started to acknowledge the role his own biases had played in the destruction of their lives. The story of Kiara and Jansen stands as a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of secrets, prejudice, and unresolved emotions. It underscores the vital importance of honesty and communication in relationships, while highlighting the desperate need for a society capable of embracing complex identities. For those who knew Kiara, her memory endures as a symbol of resilience, an embodiment of the human spirit that cannot be extinguished. Though her life was violently cut short, her legacy continues to spark vital conversations about love, acceptance, and the right to live authentically. Jansen's fate, now sealed behind prison walls, serves as a chilling cautionary tale. His story is a grim testament to the destructive power of unchecked anger and prejudice, showing how swiftly lives can be torn apart by intolerance. His life, once full of potential, is now a sobering reminder of the consequences of hatred, a stark example of how intolerance poisons the soul and destroys everything in its path. In the end, the tragedy of Kiara and Jansen is not just a tale of betrayal and violence. It is a call to action, a plea for a world where understanding triumphs over judgment, and where love, authentic, unconditional love, transcends all boundaries.